Hello, you on the other side of the screen. Welcome to another nocturnal journey through territories that might make you question things that have always seemed absolutely certain. I would love to know from what part of the world you are listening to us tonight. Perhaps from the stillness of a dark room here in the States, or maybe from some distant corner where the night hasn't arrived yet, but you're looking for this kind of calm anyway. Wherever you are, it is a pleasure to have you here. And since we are starting, if this type of content resonates with you, if these nightly explorations into the strangeness of existence are part of your relaxation routine, and yes, I know how peculiar that sounds, consider liking this video. It helps more people find this strange refuge we have built together. And if you aren't subscribed to the channel yet, well, you know where the button is. To those who are already part of this night community of insomniac curiosity seekers, my sincere thanks. You make it possible to continue exploring these questions that keep us awake, ironically, through videos made to help you sleep. Speaking of which, we need to talk about today's topic, because when I say your mind might not really be yours, I know exactly how that sounds. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, like pseudo-scientific self-help mumbo-jumbo, like that friend who smoked a little too much and started philosophizing about the Matrix. But I promise we are going to places much stranger and more scientifically grounded than any of those alternatives. So let's start at the beginning, at your beginning. Right at this moment, as you listen to these words, you are having thoughts. Maybe you are thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow. Maybe you are wondering if you should really be awake at this hour. Maybe you are judging the choice of your night playlist. Or maybe you are simply feeling that itch on your foot that just appeared out of nowhere and now you can't ignore. Sorry about that, by the way. But here is the crucial point. The starting point for this whole journey. You assume, naturally, automatically, without question, that these thoughts are yours. That you are the author of them. That there is a central you. A unified and coherent entity sitting somewhere in your head, thinking thoughts, making decisions, running the show. It is so obvious that it seems ridiculous to even question it. After all, who else could be thinking your thoughts but you? It is like asking who is breathing your breath or beating your heart. Well, actually that last analogy is more revealing than it seems. But we will get there. The sensation of being you is probably the most intimate and undeniable experience you have. More certain than any scientific fact, more immediate than any sensory perception. You wake up in the morning and there you are, the same person who went to sleep. You look in the mirror and recognize that face as yours. You remember your past and plan your future, and all of this seems to emanate from a single center, from a point of origin you call I. Except that neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and the philosophy of mind have spent the last 50 years systematically dismantling this intuition. Piece by piece, experiment by experiment, they have been building an increasingly convincing case that this central you, this commander of the ship, this author of your thoughts, might be the most sophisticated illusion your brain has ever produced. And we aren't talking about illusion in the trivial sense. It isn't like an optical illusion you can unmask if you look from the right angle. It is more fundamental than that. It is as if the very structure through which you experience reality is based on a mistaken interpretation of what is really happening. In this video, we will float gently through disturbing territories of neuroscience, philosophy, experimental psychology, and even microbiology. We will encounter experiments that show your brain making decisions before you decide. We will meet people with split brains who literally have two consciousnesses in one head, each ignoring the existence of the other. We will explore how bacteria in your gut might be influencing your mood and your choices. We will question whether your most precious memories are really yours, or if they are elaborate fictions that your brain constantly rewrites. And in the end, if we are still together, we will face the most disturbing question of all. If your mind isn't really yours, if the you is an illusion, then who the hell is here,
experiencing all of this.
But don't worry. This isn't a nihilistic journey. We aren't going to end up in a hole of existential despair. Because it turns out there is something strangely liberating in realizing that you aren't who you think you are. There is a lightness in letting go of the need to control thoughts that were never under your control in the first place. So get cozy, adjust your position, close your eyes if you like. Let's begin this gentle descent into the mechanisms that produce what you call you. And who knows, in the end, you might discover that there was never anyone to lose. Let's start with a simple experiment you can do right now. Don't worry, we don't need to get up or grab anything. It is simpler than that. I want you, when I ask, to move a finger, any finger you choose, left or right, index or pinky, it doesn't matter. But here is the detail. I want you to pay close attention to the exact moment you decide to move the finger. Not the movement itself, but the decision. That precious instant where you feel you are choosing. Ready? Now, move a finger. Did you feel it? That moment where you thought, I'm going to move this finger, and then you moved it? It seems so clear, so direct. First you decide, then you act. Cause and effect. Free will in action. Except that in 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet performed this same experiment, but with a crucial detail. He was monitoring people's brain activity while they decided to move their finger, and what he discovered was so disturbing that it still provokes heated debates decades later. Libet found that the brain starts preparing for movement. He recorded something called the readiness potential, about 350 milliseconds before the person reports being aware of the decision to move. Let that sink in for a moment. Your brain had already started the process of moving your finger a third of a second before you felt you were deciding to move. Now, 350 milliseconds might not seem like much. It's a blink of an eye, literally. But in terms of neural processing, it is an eternity. It is enough time for your brain to process complex information, activate chains of neurons, initiate motor programs, and all of this happens before you, whatever this you is, have any sensation of being in charge. If this seems disturbing, you aren't alone. Libet himself was uncomfortable with the implications of his results. Philosophers, neuroscientists, and even legal scholars have debated what this means for concepts like moral responsibility, guilt, punishment. Because if our decisions are made before we are aware of them, in what sense are we the ones deciding? The easy answer would be to say that, well, it is still your brain deciding, so it is still you. But that answer just pushes the question down a level. Because the question then becomes, in what sense are you your brain? Do you feel like you are your brain? Or do you feel like you have a brain, that you use a brain, but that the real you is something different, something that inhabits and commands this gelatinous organ? And here we begin to see the problem. The sensation of being a you, distinct from your brain, is part of the illusion. There isn't a little homunculus sitting in the command chair of your skull, watching sensory data on screens, pushing decision buttons. There are just billions of neurons doing what neurons do, firing, connecting, creating patterns of activity. And somehow, from this whirlwind of electricity and chemistry, emerges the sensation that there is someone in charge. But Libet's experiments were just the beginning. More recent studies, using much more sophisticated brain imaging technologies, have managed to predict simple decisions up to 7 to 10 seconds in advance. 10 seconds. That isn't a processing delay. That is your brain having already chosen which button you are going to press, while you still think you are pondering the options. One of these studies, conducted by John Dylan Haynes in 2008, asked people to choose between pressing a button with their left or right hand whenever they wanted. Using fMRI scanners to observe activity patterns in the prefrontal and parietal cortex, researchers were able to predict which button the person would press with up to 60% accuracy. a result significantly above chance, up to 10 seconds before the person reported being aware of the choice. 10 seconds is enough time for you to have complex thoughts. It is enough time for you to have internal conversations about what you are going to do. But apparently, while you are having that internal conversation, your brain has already made the decision. The conversation is retrospective, a narrative you build to make sense of something that has already happened. If your head is spinning a little right now, that is perfectly understandable. We are questioning something that seems more fundamental than anything else. The feeling that you are in control of your own mind. And I am not asking you to simply accept this and move on. I am asking you to sit with the discomfort for a moment. Feel what it means to seriously consider that your decisions might not be yours. Because here is where it gets even stranger. You might be thinking, okay, maybe my brain decides before my conscious self, but it is still my brain. It is still me in a broader sense. And that is a reasonable objection. Until you meet the split brain patients. In the 1960s, in an attempt to treat severe forms of epilepsy, surgeons began performing a radical operation. They cut the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. The idea was to prevent epileptic seizures from spreading from one side of the brain to the other. And it worked. The epilepsy improved dramatically. But then something extraordinary began to be noticed. These patients, most of the time, seemed completely normal. They talked normally, lived their lives. No one looking from the outside would suspect anything was different. But under carefully controlled experimental conditions, it became clear that something deeply strange was happening. Each hemisphere of the brain controls and receives information, primarily from the opposite side of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right side, and vice versa. Normally, this isn't a problem because the two hemispheres are constantly talking through the corpus callosum, sharing information. But cut that bridge, and you effectively have two brains in the same head. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga spent decades studying these patients and discovering things that completely challenge our notion of a unified self. In a famous experiment, he showed different images to each hemisphere separately. To the left eye, which connects to the right hemisphere, he showed an image of a snow shovel. To the right eye, left hemisphere, he showed an image of a chicken. Then he asked the patient to point with each hand to related images. The left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere that saw the snow shovel, pointed to an image of a winter scene. The right hand pointed to a chicken. So far, everything makes sense. Each hemisphere is responding to what it saw. But here is the fascinating part. When they asked the patient why he pointed to those images, he, and here, he specifically means the verbal left hemisphere, said something like, well, the chicken goes with the chicken foot, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken coop. A completely logical explanation, completely fabricated, because the left hemisphere had no idea that the right hemisphere had seen a snow shovel. It was literally inventing a reason to justify an action it didn't understand. Gazzaniga called this phenomenon the left brain interpreter, a module in the left hemisphere that apparently is always generating causal narratives to explain behaviors, even when it doesn't have access to the true reasons. And here is the disturbing point. If this interpreter can invent convincing reasons for behaviors caused by information it doesn't have access to, what guarantees that it isn't doing this all the time? What guarantees that the reasons you give for your own actions, the narratives you tell about why you did what you did, aren't also post hoc fabrications, stories your brain invents to make sense of decisions made by processes you have no conscious access to? And it gets stranger. In some split-brain patients, the two hemispheres could literally disagree. One patient tried to leave the house with one hand, while the other hand pulled him back. Another tried to hug his wife with one arm while the other arm pushed her away. It is as if there were literally two people, two consciousnesses, two sources of will, sharing the same body. But before this patient had the split brain, when the corpus callosum was still intact, how many people were there? The obvious answer is one. But if cutting a bundle of fibers can turn one person into two, what does that say about the unity of that original one? Maybe it wasn't as unified as it seemed. Maybe there were always multiple processes, multiple potential selves, but they were communicating so efficiently that they created the illusion of singularity. And if this is true for people with split brains, why wouldn't it be true for you too? How many yous exist in your head, each pulling in slightly different directions, each with its own agendas, but normally coordinated enough to create the illusion of a single coherent agent? Think about the moments when you feel torn. Part of me wants to go to the gym, but another part wants to stay on the couch. We usually treat this as a metaphor, as a way of talking about internal conflict. But what if it is more literal than that? What if there really are different systems in your brain? Different coalitions of neurons, each computing different courses of action. And what you experience as you is just the result of which coalition gained enough strength in that moment. The Portuguese neuroscientist Antonio Damasio proposed something along these lines. He argues that there isn't a single self, but multiple self-processes happening in parallel. There is the proto-self, related to the state of the body. There is the core self, related to the processing of emotions moment by moment. And there is the autobiographical self, the narrative you build about who you are over time. And these processes might not always be in agreement. You might have an autobiographical narrative of being a calm and controlled person, while your core self is flooded with anxiety because of signals from the proto-self about bodily imbalances that you don't even consciously perceive. Which of these is the real you? The answer might be all of them, and none of them simultaneously. If this is starting to feel like you are less of a coherent author of your life, and more of a disorganized committee of neural processes all screaming at the same time, well, maybe you are starting to get the idea. But we haven't even gotten close to how deep this rabbit hole goes. Because so far we have talked about conscious decisions and cognitive processes. But what if I told you that even your most basic desires, the things you want, in a visceral and undeniable way, might not really be yours? That they might be products of molecules floating in your brain, of genetic instructions inherited from ancestors who didn't even know your name, of influences so subtle you don't even realize they are there. Let's talk about the neurobiology of desire. About how the architecture of your brain, built over millions of years of evolution and modified by your particular experiences, determines what you find attractive, what you seek, what you avoid, and how all this determination happens backstage without you having any say in the matter. Consider dopamine, that neurotransmitter everyone has heard of. It is often described as the pleasure molecule, but that is a simplification. Dopamine isn't so much about pleasure, but about motivation, about wanting. It is released in anticipation of reward, creating that feeling of I need to have this, whether this is food, sex, money, social approval, or the next notification on your phone. Studies in animals have shown that if you block dopamine receptors in a rat's brain, it doesn't lose the ability to feel pleasure. If you put food directly in its mouth, it will still chew and seem to enjoy it, but it won't move to seek the food. It will literally starve to death, surrounded by food, because it lost the motivation to go after it. Dopamine doesn't say, "This is good." It says, "Go get this." Now, the levels of dopamine in your brain, the sensitivity of your dopamine receptors, the efficiency with which your brain recaptures and recycles dopamine. All of this is determined by a combination of genetics and life experience. You didn't choose any of this. And yet, this literally determines what you will want to pursue, how much effort you will be willing to make, how motivated you will feel. People with certain genetic polymorphisms in dopamine receptors are statistically more prone to novelty-seeking behaviors, to addictions, to impulsivity. They literally feel the pull of potential rewards more intensely. And people with other polymorphisms are more cautious, more risk-averse. Which group is right? Neither. They are just different configurations of the same basic system. And it isn't just dopamine. There is serotonin influencing your mood and your impulsivity. There is norepinephrine modulating your arousal and attention. There are endorphins creating that feeling of well-being after exercise. There is oxytocin and vasopressin shaping your social bonds and your trust in others. There is cortisol keeping you alert to threats, or keeping you chronically anxious if your levels are dysregulated. All of these are systems that operate far, far below the level of consciousness. You don't decide to release more serotonin when you are feeling down. You don't choose to have a lower cortisol response to stressors. These things simply happen, based on your particular neurobiology, and then you experience the results as your feelings and your desires and your choices. Or consider something even more basic: sex hormones. Testosterone, present in all humans but typically in higher levels in men, influences not only libido but also aggression, competitiveness, status seeking. Estrogen and progesterone, fluctuating through the menstrual cycle, influence mood, risk perception, even preferences for certain facial features in potential partners. Studies have shown that women in the fertile phase of their cycle, when estrogen is high, tend to prefer more masculine faces, more defined jaws, more pronounced brows, while in other phases they tend to prefer more feminized, softer faces. This isn't a conscious choice. No one thinks, I'm ovulating. I think today I'll find defined jaws more attractive. The change simply happens silently, guided by hormones signaling ancient neural systems about optimal reproductive strategies. And here is the point: when you feel attraction to someone, you experience that as your desire, as you wanting that person. But how much of that you wanting is really you, in the sense of an autonomous agent making a choice? And how much is just hormones and neurotransmitters orchestrating a response that was selected over millions of years of evolution because it increased the reproduction chances of your ancestors? You might object, but I can choose not to act on my desires. I can feel attraction and decide to do nothing about it. And that is true. But where does that ability to inhibit impulses come from? From areas like the prefrontal cortex, especially the regions that mature last in human development. And how strong your inhibition is, how easy or difficult you find it to resist impulses, is also determined by your particular neurobiology. People with damage to the prefrontal cortex often lose the ability to inhibit inappropriate behaviors. They become impulsive, socially inappropriate, unable to think about long-term consequences. The them is still there. The subjective experience of consciousness continues. But the brake that allows us to say, "No, I won't do this," is broken. So even your ability to resist your own desires, this thing that seems to be the essence of self-control, of free will, depends on brain structures you didn't choose to have, operating in ways you don't consciously control. And we are just scratching the surface. We haven't even talked about how childhood experiences literally remodel the architecture of the developing brain, creating patterns that will influence how you react to situations decades later. We haven't talked about epigenetics, about how experiences can literally switch genes on and off, changing which version of you expresses itself. We haven't talked about neuroplasticity, about how every experience slightly changes neural connections, meaning the you of now is literally a different brain than the you of yesterday. But I think the pattern is becoming clear. Every time you dig a level deeper in search of the real you, the autonomous agent making free decisions, you find only more mechanisms, more causal processes, more systems you didn't choose and don't consciously control. It is like looking for the pilot of a plane and discovering there is no pilot, only automated systems so complex and so well coordinated that they create the impression that someone is in charge. And before this starts to seem too abstract, too distant from your actual experience, let me bring it back to something concrete. Have you ever had that moment where you say something and immediately think, why the hell did I say that? Or you act in a way that surprises even yourself, that seems not to fit with who you think you are? In those moments, you are catching a glimpse of what is always happening, but which is normally camouflaged by the coherent narrative your left brain interpreter is constantly building. You are seeing the gap between the processes that actually generate behavior and the story you tell about those behaviors. Most of the time, the story is convincing enough that you don't even realize it is a story. But sometimes, the seams show. Sometimes you act according to motivations you don't fully understand, that you can't adequately explain. And then you find yourself rationalizing, creating a narrative that makes sense, that preserves the illusion that you were in control the whole time. And again, if this is making you feel a little uncomfortable, as if the ground were becoming less solid under your conceptual feet, you are exactly where you should be, because we are just starting to explore how deep this question of who you really are goes. And this discomfort you might be feeling now, this sense that something fundamental is being questioned, is in itself fascinating. Because where does that discomfort come from? Who is uncomfortable? If there is no central you, what exactly is feeling threatened by these ideas? But let's leave that question hanging in the air for now, and dive even deeper. Because so far, we have talked about internal processes in your brain, neurons, hormones, brain structures. But it turns out that the influence on what you think and feel and desire doesn't stop at the boundary of your skull. There are external forces shaping your mind in ways you probably never realized. Let's talk about priming, about cognitive biases, about all the subtle and invisible ways the environment around you sculpts your thoughts without you having any awareness that you are being influenced. Priming is a psychological phenomenon where exposure to a stimulus influences your response to a subsequent stimulus without awareness of that influence. And the effects can be surprisingly specific and powerful. In a classic experiment conducted by John Bard in the 1990s, participants were exposed to words related to stereotypes of elderly people. Words like forgetful, gray, wrinkle, Florida. They thought they were taking a simple language test. But afterward, when they left the lab, something strange happened. They walked slower down the hallway. Not dramatically, not in a way they consciously noticed. But observers objectively measuring walking speed noticed a clear difference. The mere exposure to words associated with old age activated mental schemas about elderly people, and these schemas included not just abstract concepts, but also associated behaviors, like walking slower. And this happened completely outside of consciousness. No one thought, I saw words about old people, I guess I'll walk slower now. The behavior simply changed. Now, it is true that some of these social priming studies have faced replication issues, and science is actively debating how robust and generalizable these effects really are. But even if the specific effects are smaller or more contextual than the original study suggested, the fundamental principle remains solid. Our behavior and judgment can be influenced by stimuli we don't consciously process. Consider studies on positive and negative word priming. Flashing a positive word so fast you can't consciously register it before asking someone to judge a person can cause them to judge that person more favorably. And the reverse works too. Negative words presented subliminally lead to harsher judgments. You think you are making a rational judgment about someone based on their objective qualities. But in reality, your judgment is being influenced by stimuli you didn't even see consciously, processed by parts of your brain that don't communicate with your narrative consciousness. Or consider studies on environmental priming. Experiments have shown that people in rooms smelling of cleaning products are more likely to wipe crumbs off the table after a snack. They don't perceive the smell consciously. They don't think, smells like cleaner, I guess I should clean. They simply find themselves acting cleaner. And if you ask why, they will invent reasons. Oh, I always try to keep things tidy. I don't like leaving a mess. Another study showed that having money visible in the environment, even images of money, makes people behave more individualistically, less likely to help others, more focused on themselves. Again, completely outside of consciousness. The simple visual symbol of money activates schemas associated with self-sufficiency and competition, and these schemas then influence behavior. If you are thinking, that wouldn't work on me, I would notice, well, that thought is exactly part of the problem. We all think we are special, that we are more conscious, more in control than the average person. But studies consistently show that even people informed about priming are still affected by it. Conscious knowledge of the effect does not provide immunity. And this brings us to even more uncomfortable territory. Cognitive biases. There are literally hundreds of them, cataloged by cognitive psychology, and they all represent systematic and predictable ways in which our thinking deviates from some ideal standard of rationality. There is confirmation bias, where you seek out and interpret information in ways that confirm your pre-existing beliefs. You don't consciously decide to do this. Your brain simply gives more weight to evidence that confirms what you already believe and discounts contrary evidence. And then you rationalize this asymmetry by saying the evidence confirming your view was more convincing, more reliable. There's the availability heuristic, where you judge the probability of events based on how easily examples come to mind. After seeing news about plane crashes, flying seems more dangerous, even if objectively the probability hasn't changed. Your sense of risk is distorted not by statistical reality, but by how vivid and accessible your memories of similar events are. There is the halo effect, where your overall impression of a person influences your judgments about specific attributes. If someone is attractive, you unconsciously assume they are also smarter, kinder, more competent. And you think you are making independent judgments about each quality, but actually, they are all being contaminated by an initial impression. There is anchoring bias, where the first number you hear in a negotiation, even if completely arbitrary, influences your subsequent judgment of fair value. Salespeople know this. That is why initial prices are always high. They set an anchor that makes subsequent offers seem more reasonable in comparison. And here is the crucial point about all these biases. They aren't occasional glitches. They are features of how the system works. Your brain evolved to make quick judgments with incomplete information, to use shortcuts, to rely on heuristics that work well enough in most situations, but systematically lead to errors in specific contexts. And you can't simply turn these biases off by knowing about them. Studies with decision-making experts, people who study cognitive biases professionally, show that they still fall into the same traps. Declarative knowledge about a bias doesn't change the automated processes that produce the bias. It is like optical illusions. Even after someone explains to you that two lines are the same length, they still look different. The illusion persists because it happens in stages of visual processing that don't have access to your conceptual understanding. The same goes for cognitive biases. They happen in processing stages that precede and influence your conscious thinking. So every time you think you are thinking rationally, making objective judgments, choosing freely, You are actually operating through systems that have all these biases built in. You are like a computer trying to do precise calculations, but with a slightly defective chip that introduces systematic errors. And the computer can't even detect the errors, because the error-checking system itself is running on the same defective chip. But wait, it gets even stranger, because it isn't just internal brain processes and subtle environmental influences. It turns out that the very structure of the language you use to think, the conceptual categories available in your culture, literally shape what you can think and how you experience reality. There is a field called linguistic relativity, sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that explores how language influences thought. Strong versions of this hypothesis, that you can't think thoughts for which you don't have words, are probably exaggerated. But there is substantial evidence that language influences how you habitually think, how you categorize experiences, even how you perceive basic things. For example, some languages don't have words for relative directions like left and right. Instead, they use only absolute directions like north, south, east, west. Speakers of these languages, like the Cook Tayor in Australia, develop an extraordinary sense of spatial orientation. They always know where north is, even indoors, because their language requires them to constantly track cardinal directions to make basic spatial statements. They didn't choose to develop this ability. The structure of their language made it necessary, and as a result, they literally experience space differently. When you ask them to arrange cards with events in temporal sequence, English speakers typically arrange them from left to right. But Cook Tayor speakers arrange them from east to west, no matter which way they are sitting. Their mental representation of time is anchored in cardinal directions, because their language of space is anchored in those directions. Or consider colors. Different languages divide the color spectrum in different ways. Russian has separate words for light blue and dark blue that are as distinct as blue and green are in English. And studies show that native Russian speakers are faster at discriminating between shades of blue that cross this linguistic boundary. They don't just have different words, they perceive a distinction more readily because their language has trained them to pay attention to it. This means the language you speak literally filters your perception. You aren't seeing raw reality and then choosing how to describe it. Language shapes what you notice, what you consider significant, how you divide the continuous flow of experience into discrete categories. And this extends far beyond basic sensory perceptions. Different cultures have different emotional vocabularies, different ways of categorizing internal states. And these differences aren't just superficial. They aren't just different labels for the same universal experiences. There is evidence that people in different cultures actually experience emotions in distinctly different ways. For example, there is a German word, Schadenfreude, which means pleasure derived from another person's suffering. There isn't a direct equivalent word in English, although we understand the concept. And some would argue that having that word makes Germans more likely to notice and recognize that experience when it arises. The word doesn't just describe a pre-existing experience, it helps create the experience by providing a recognizable category. Or consider that some languages, like Japanese, have multiple words for different types of love or different qualities of silence, distinctions that English speakers have to explain with entire phrases. Do speakers of those languages experience these nuances more vividly because they have precise terms for them? It is hard to say for sure, but there are reasons to think so. And here is where this connects with our central question about the mind not being yours. The language you use to think, the conceptual vocabulary through which you interpret your experience, isn't something you invented. It is something you inherited from your culture, that you absorbed through years of immersion in specific social contexts, When you think, I am feeling anxious, you are using a category you learned. And that category comes with a whole set of associations, of cultural narratives about what anxiety is, what causes it, what you should do about it. And these narratives shape your actual experience of anxiety. In cultures where anxiety is viewed as a sign of weakness, as something shameful, people might have more intense experiences of anxiety about their anxiety, meta-anxiety. In cultures where anxiety is normalized, seen as an expected part of the human experience, the same physiological state might be less distressing because it doesn't carry the same additional weight of judgment. Anthropologist and psychiatrist Arthur Kleinman studied how depression is experienced differently in different cultures. In many non-Western cultures, what in Western contexts would be diagnosed as depression is experienced and described primarily in somatic terms, pains, fatigue, digestive problems, rather than in emotional or cognitive terms like sadness or lack of meaning. It isn't that one description is true and the other false. Depression involves physiological and psychological components. But which aspect you notice, which aspect seems more real, more central, depends in part on the conceptual categories your culture has provided you. So even your most intimate internal states, your emotions, your feelings about yourself, are partially constructed by the language and concepts you absorbed from the outside. The experiencing you isn't a pure and isolated entity observing objective internal states. It is a you already shaped and structured by cultural frameworks. And this leads us to something even more fundamental: memory. Because if you are defined by continuity through time, if you are the same person you were 10 years ago because you have memories connecting the present to the past, then the integrity of those memories is crucial. The problem is that memories are notoriously unreliable. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has spent decades demonstrating how easy it is to implant false memories in people. In famous experiments, she managed to make participants remember childhood events that never happened, like getting lost in a mall or being attacked by an animal, simply through carefully crafted suggestions and subtle social pressure. The participants weren't lying consciously. They really believed these memories were real. They could describe details, express associated emotions. The false memories were phenomenologically indistinguishable from real memories, and it isn't just about implanting completely new memories. Existing memories are constantly rewritten. Every time you remember something, you aren't accessing a stable file stored somewhere in the brain. You are reconstructing the memory from fragments, filling in gaps, adding details that seem plausible, modifying aspects based on your current beliefs and knowledge. And then, when you save the memory back, you are saving this reconstructed version, not the original. Memory is more like a game of telephone than a filing system. Every retrieval introduces small distortions, and these distortions accumulate over time. Studies have shown that eyewitnesses to crimes, when questioned repeatedly with suggestive questions, gradually incorporate the suggestions into their memories. And not only are the wrong criminals convicted because of this, the witnesses themselves spend the rest of their lives believing in memories that were partially fabricated through the interrogation process. So, if your memories aren't reliable, if they are malleable and constantly rewritten, what does this mean for the autobiographical narrative you tell about who you are? That story about your childhood, about formative events, about why you are the way you are. How much of that story is retroactive construction, unconscious fiction that you refined over the years until it seemed absolutely real? You might have a vivid memory of an event that supposedly shaped your personality. But did the event really happen that way? Or was your memory influenced by how relatives told the story, by photos you saw, by your own psychological needs to create a coherent narrative about yourself. And here is the real problem. You don't have access to the original memories to compare. You only have the current versions. You can't know which were distorted and which remain accurate. Your entire personal history, the foundation of the autobiographical you, is potentially suspect. This doesn't mean you should doubt all your memories equally. Some are likely more reliable than others. But it means you can't use memories as incontrovertible evidence of who you really are. The past you remember might not be the past you lived. And if the past is suspect, if memories are constructions, then the you that is supposedly continuous through time is also a construction. You aren't a fixed entity traversing time. You are more like a river. The name stays the same, but the water is constantly changing. Or maybe a better metaphor. You are like a character in a story that is constantly being rewritten. The character seems coherent because you are always editing to maintain coherence. But if you could see the previous drafts, you would realize how many contradictions were smoothed over, how many inconvenient details were forgotten, how many parts were invented to fill gaps. Take a deep breath. I know we are in quite destabilizing territory now. We are questioning not just your decisions or your desires, but the very continuity of your identity through time. And we still have more layers to peel back. Because believe it or not, we haven't reached the strangest part yet. Because so far, all the influences we have discussed, neurons, hormones, priming, language, memory, at least happen inside your body, inside your head. But it turns out that the boundary between you and not you is much more porous than you imagine. There are organisms living inside you, influencing your behavior, shaping your preferences, and you have absolutely no idea they are there. Let's talk about your gut microbiome. You have probably heard of it. The trillions of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other microorganisms that live in your digestive tract. It is often described in benign terms, good bacteria that help with digestion. And yes, they do that, but they are doing much, much more. In the last 15 years, researchers have discovered something extraordinary. There is constant bidirectional communication between your gut and your brain, something called the gut-brain axis. And it isn't passive communication. The bacteria in your gut produce neurotransmitters, the same molecules your brain uses to process thoughts and emotions. Approximately 90% of your body's serotonin, that crucial neurotransmitter for mood and well-being, is produced in the gut. Not in the brain. In the gut, by bacteria. And these bacteria also produce dopamine, GABA, acetylcholine, a whole pharmacy of molecules that influence how you feel and how you think. Now, it is true that not all serotonin produced in the gut crosses the blood-brain barrier to directly affect the brain. The relationship is more complex than that. But gut bacteria influence the brain through multiple pathways, via the vagus nerve, via the immune system, via metabolites they produce that enter the bloodstream. Studies in mice have shown disturbing things. Mice raised in completely sterile environments without any gut bacteria show abnormal behaviors. They are more anxious, more impulsive, have socialization problems. But if you transplant the microbiome from normal mice to them, the behaviors improve. Even more disturbing, if you take gut bacteria from anxious mice and transplant them to calm mice, the calm mice become more anxious. And the reverse works too. You can literally transfer behavioral traits through microbiome transplants. But that is in mice, you might think. Humans are different. Except that studies in humans are starting to show similar patterns. People with depression have gut microbiome profiles distinctly different from people without depression. People with anxiety too. People with autism frequently have specific gut dysbioses. And it isn't just correlation. Preliminary studies show that supplementation with certain probiotic strains can reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression in humans. The effects aren't huge, We aren't saying you can cure clinical depression with yogurt, but there is a measurable effect. Bacteria you didn't even know you had are influencing your emotional state. And it gets stranger. There is evidence that your gut microbiome can influence your food preferences. Think about that for a moment. The bacteria in your gut feed on what you eat. Different bacteria thrive on different diets, and these bacteria can signal to your brain through the gut-brain axis, influencing your cravings for certain foods. If you have a large population of bacteria that thrive on sugar, they might literally be making you crave more sugar. That craving for sweets you feel, that compulsion for chocolate at 3 in the afternoon, how much of that is you wanting it, and how much is a population of microorganisms manipulating your neural systems to ensure their own sustenance? And we aren't just speculating here. Studies have shown that gut bacteria produce molecules that mimic hunger and satiety hormones. They can literally hack your appetite systems. You think you are feeling hungry because your body needs nutrients, but actually you might be feeling hungry because your gut bacteria want to be fed. So when you make a food choice, I'm going to eat this chocolate bar, who exactly is choosing? You, with your preferences and values? Or a coalition of trillions of microorganisms that figured out how to manipulate your neural reward circuits? And gut bacteria are just the beginning. There is a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii that infects about a third of the global human population. Its definitive host is felines, cats, but it can infect almost any warm-blooded animal, including humans. And it does something extraordinary. It changes behavior. In rodents, Toxoplasma gondii does something very specific. Rodents normally have an instinctive fear of the smell of cat urine, a perfectly sensible evolutionary response given that cats eat rodents. But rodents infected with Toxoplasma lose this fear. Some studies even suggest they become attracted to the smell of cat urine. Why? Because the parasite needs to return to a feline host to complete its life cycle. By making the rodent less cautious around cats, the parasite increases its chances that the rodent will be eaten, taking the parasite back to where it needs to be. It is behavioral manipulation for the parasite's reproductive ends. But humans aren't rodents, you say. True, but studies have shown that humans infected with Toxoplasma also show subtle behavioral changes. Infected men tend to be more impulsive, more likely to break rules, have slower reaction times. Infected women tend to be more extroverted, more confident. And there are intriguing correlations, although not necessarily causal, between Toxoplasma infection and things like car accidents, schizophrenia, suicidal behavior. Again, correlation is not causation, and the science here is still developing, but the possibility is disturbing. A single-celled parasite could be influencing your personality, your risk behaviors, maybe even your mental health. You think your personality traits are intrinsically yours, products of your genetics and experiences. But what if some of them are products of a parasite that infected you years ago, that you don't know you have, that is subtly adjusting your brain chemistry for its own evolutionary ends? And Toxoplasma isn't unique. There are other parasites that manipulate host behavior. There is a fungus, Ophiocordyceps, that infects ants and literally controls their movements, making them climb to specific locations where the fungus can sporulate effectively. The ant becomes a zombie, a vehicle for the fungus's reproductive ends. Humans don't have such a dramatic equivalent, at least not that we know of. But the principle is established. External organisms can hack host nervous systems to change behavior. And you are constantly hosting a vast community of organisms. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, possibly parasites, whose evolutionary agendas don't necessarily align with what you would consciously identify as your best interests. So when you feel an impulse, when you make a decision, when you act in a certain way, there might be forces you can't even imagine pulling the strings. You are less of an autonomous individual and more of a walking ecology. an ecosystem of competing and cooperating interests, all contributing to the aggregate behavior you identify as yours. And this brings us to even more fundamental questions about where you end and the rest of the world begins. Because those boundaries, which seem so obvious, your skin is the limit between you and not you, reveal themselves to be increasingly arbitrary the more you examine them. Consider your mitochondria. They are in every cell of your body, producing the energy that keeps you alive. You probably learned in school that mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. But here is something that maybe wasn't emphasized. Mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from the DNA in the nucleus of your cells. And the reason for this is that mitochondria were originally independent bacteria that billions of years ago formed a symbiotic relationship with ancestral cells. So every cell in your body contains what were originally separate organisms. You are literally a colony, a symphony of entities that at some point in evolutionary history were distinct, but are now so integrated they seem to be one thing. And if you zoom out beyond the body, the boundaries get even blurrier. Consider tools, language, culture. Philosopher Andy Clark argues that humans are natural-born cyborgs, organisms that habitually incorporate external resources into their cognitive processes. Your smartphone, for example, it isn't literally connected to your brain, but functionally it has extended your memory. How many phone numbers do you know by heart now, compared to 20 years ago? You outsource that memory function to an external device. And it isn't just memory. GPS extended your spatial navigation. Google extended your access to factual information. Social media extended your social network, far beyond what would be possible to maintain through face-to-face interaction. You might say, but those are just tools I use. But where is the line between using a tool and the tool becoming part of your cognitive system? If you are constantly checking your smartphone, if it is always within reach, if you feel anxious when separated from it, in what sense is it not part of your extended mind? Philosopher Daniel Dennett uses the analogy of a thermometer. A thermometer doesn't feel heat the way you do. But if you want to know the temperature, you consult the thermometer, and then the thermometer's reading becomes part of your knowledge about the world. The thermometer extended your sensory capacity beyond what your biological body could perceive alone. Likewise, calculators extend your arithmetic capacity. Notebooks extend your memory. Books extend your access to the thoughts of people who lived centuries ago. And each of these extensions changes not just what you can do, but how you think. People who grew up with calculators think differently about math than people who had to do complex calculations in their heads. People who grew up with GPS develop different spatial navigation skills than people who had to memorize maps. Technology is not neutral. It shapes cognition. And now, with artificial intelligence becoming increasingly integrated into cognitive tasks, the lines get even more blurred. When you use an AI assistant to draft an email, who is the author? You provided the intent, the general ideas. The AI provided the structure, the specific words. The final product is a collaboration. But how do you divide the authorship? And if you use AI to help make decisions, say a recommendation system that suggests what movie to watch, and you follow the recommendation, who made the choice? You, who gave the final command, or the algorithm that presented the options in a way that made a particular choice more likely? These might seem like esoteric questions, but they have practical implications. The more we outsource cognitive functions to external systems, the more our cognition becomes distributed, spread across networks of tools and technologies. And if cognition is distributed like that, where exactly is the you? You might object, but there is still a central self that decides to use these tools, that interprets the results, that makes final judgments. But remember Libet's experiments, the left brain interpreter, all the processes operating below the conscious level. This central self, that seems to be making judgments, is already itself being influenced by thousands of factors you don't control and don't perceive. So what is left? If you aren't the author of your thoughts because they arise from unconscious neural processes, if you aren't the owner of your desires because they are shaped by hormones and neurotransmitters and bacteria and parasites, if you aren't the master of your memories because they are constantly rewritten, if you aren't independent of the external world because your cognition is distributed across tools and culture, then what the hell is this you that you feel so vividly? The answer from some philosophical and contemplative traditions is radical. There is no you, at least not in the sense of a unified, permanent, autonomous entity. The I is an illusion, a useful fiction the brain generates, but which corresponds to nothing real. Buddhism, for example, has taught this for over 2,000 years. The concept of anatta, or no self, is central to Buddhist philosophy. The idea is that when you examine your experience carefully, you don't find any permanent self. There are thoughts, but no thinker. There are sensations, but no experiencer separate from the sensations. There is only a stream of experiences arising and passing, and the sensation that there is a you, observing all of this, is just another experience arising in that stream. Now, you might find this absurd. Of course there is a self. I am here, having this experience right now. I can't deny my own existence, and this objection is ancient. Descartes formulated exactly this argument. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. If there is thought, there must be a thinker. But Buddhists and some contemporary Western philosophers would say this logic is flawed. There is thought, yes, but that doesn't necessarily imply there is a permanent and unified entity doing the thinking. There might just be thought happening, and the sensation of a thinker is part of the content of the thought, not something separate from it. It is like saying, it is raining. Grammatically, the phrase implies a subject, something that is doing the raining, but there is no separate entity from the rain itself making the rain happen. There is just the process of raining. Likewise, there might just be the process of thinking, and we add a thinker out of linguistic and conceptual habit, not because there is really a separate entity there. If this still seems too abstract, let's consider it from another angle. Try doing a simple exercise right now. Try to find the you, not conceptually, but experientially. Look inside your current experience and try to locate this thing you call I. You might notice thoughts, but thoughts come and go. They can't be the permanent I because they are temporary. You might notice bodily sensations, but those are also constantly changing. You might notice emotions, but emotions are notoriously transient. You might think, well, I am the observer of all these phenomena. But when you try to find this observer, you find only more thoughts, more sensations. The very sense of being an observer is something you observe, which means it can't be the ultimate observer. It is like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. You can see through your eyes, but you can't see the eyes themselves directly. Likewise, you can observe thoughts, sensations, emotions, but you can't observe the observer, because the moment you try, it becomes just another object of observation. And if you continue this process, trying to find the I and always finding only more temporary experiences, you might start to get an intuition of what these contemplative traditions are pointing at. The I is elusive not because it is hidden somewhere deep, but because there might be nothing to find. The search itself might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Neuroscientists like Thomas Metzinger have reached similar conclusions from a completely different direction. Metzinger argues that the self is a model the brain creates, a useful representation, but not a real entity. It is like the graphical interface on your computer. You see icons, folders, a desktop, but those things don't literally exist in the computer. They are visual representations of underlying processes and data. They are useful metaphors that make the system navigable. Likewise, the self is an interface your brain generates to make navigating the social world and coordinating behavior more efficient. But the interface isn't the underlying reality. The neural processes, the electrochemistry, the firing patterns, those things are real. The you that seems to be experiencing all of this is the interface, the model, not the actual operating system. And here is where this can get liberating paradoxically. If the I is a construction, an illusion, then many of the problems you attribute to having an I also dissolve. Anxiety about self-image. Self-image is part of the illusion. Worry about self-worth. Self-worth presupposes a self that can have or not have worth. Fear of the death of the I. If there is no self to begin with, what exactly is dying? Now, I am not suggesting that these intuitions instantly solve all psychological problems. Clearly, even people deeply versed in no-self philosophy still experience suffering. But there is something about recognizing the constructed nature of the self that can create a certain distance, a certain lightness. If you know your thoughts aren't yours in the sense of being generated by some essential you, they become less personal. That self-critical thought isn't you being cruel to yourself. It is just a neural pattern firing, conditioned by past experiences, reinforced by habits, but no more essentially you than a cloud passing in the sky is yours because you saw it. And if your desires aren't ultimately yours, but products of neurobiological, social, ecological systems, then maybe you can relate to them differently. You can observe them as you would observe the weather, without feeling you have to identify them as your essence. You can choose which desires to cultivate and which to let pass, not out of moralistic repression, but out of an understanding that you are more spacious than any particular desire. Meditation practitioners often report something along these lines. After years of practice observing thoughts and sensations arise and pass, they develop a different relationship with internal experience. Thoughts still arise, but there is less identification with them. It is less "I am thinking this," and more "a thought of such kind is arising." Subtle but profound. Neuroscientist Sam Harris, who has practiced meditation extensively, describes moments where the sense of self simply isn't there. There is still consciousness, still experience, but there isn't that contraction around a point that says, "This is me," separate from all that. There is just openness, experience happening without a separate experiencer. And here is the final paradox. If there is no self, who is having this realization? Who is experiencing the liberation of realizing there is no self? The answer might be that the question itself is poorly phrased. There is understanding happening, there is liberation happening, but there isn't necessarily someone to whom these things are happening. There is just the happening. This might sound like wordplay, like verbal evasion, and maybe it is impossible to convey completely in language, because our language is structured around subjects and objects, agents and actions. Every sentence I construct reinforces the dualistic structure of a self doing or experiencing things, but the structure itself might be the problem. Some philosophers have argued that the problem of the self is largely a problem created by grammar. Indo-European languages require subjects for verbs. You can't just say "is thinking" without an I or it. But in some other languages the structure is different, and maybe those languages allow for different conceptions of experience. In any case, whether the self is a total illusion or a useful but not fundamental construction, one thing seems clear from everything we have explored. The idea of a simple, unified, autonomous you, with transparent control over your thoughts and choices, is untenable. The reality is much more complex, much more intertwined, much more distributed. You aren't a pilot navigating a vehicle called a body. You are more like a pattern emerging from countless processes, most of which you will never perceive. You are less an author and more a chapter being written by forces that don't recognize your authorship. And maybe that isn't cause for despair, but for relief. Because if you aren't ultimately responsible for being who you are, if all of this, your personality, your preferences, your successes, your failures, is the product of causes you didn't choose, then maybe you can be a little kinder to yourself. Maybe you can let go of the need to control the uncontrollable and simply observe the unfolding of experience with curiosity instead of judgment. And if you aren't essentially separate from the rest of the world, if the boundaries are more fluid than you thought, then maybe you can also feel a deeper connection. You aren't an isolated atom of consciousness floating in a hostile void. You are part of a vast and interconnected network of neurons, of microorganisms, of social systems, of tools and technologies, of evolutionary lineages stretching billions of years back. There is a passage by physicist Alan Lightman that I like, where he describes lying under the stars on a clear night, feeling simultaneously his infinitesimal smallness in the cosmos and his deep connection to it. He writes that he is literally made of stars. The atoms in his body were forged in the hearts of stars that exploded billions of years ago. You aren't just in the universe, you are the universe, a small temporary fold in the fabric of the cosmos, becoming conscious of itself for a few brief moments. If this is true, and physically it is, then the question of whether your mind is yours reveals itself not so much as wrong, but as poorly formulated. There is no yours and not yours. There are just processes happening, consciousness emerging, experience unfolding, and for practical reasons, for social convenience, we draw boundaries and say, this here is you, that over there is not you. But those boundaries are conventions, not discoveries of some deep metaphysical truth. And recognizing this doesn't mean you stop functioning, that you collapse into nihilistic paralysis. You will still wake up tomorrow, drink coffee, make choices, live your life. But maybe you do it with a little less contraction, a little less need for things to be a certain way for you to be okay. Because who is this you that needs to be okay anyway? Breathe. Feel the weight of your body where you are lying or sitting. Notice the sounds around you. And for a moment, just for a moment, see if you can let go of the need to be someone, to understand everything, to have control. See what is left when you stop trying. There might be a surprising stillness there, a peace that doesn't depend on having answers, but rather on resting in the question, without needing to solve it. And it is here, in this space between certainty and dissolution, that we arrive at one of the most baffling questions of all. If your mind isn't really yours, if the you is a construction, a useful but fundamentally empty illusion, then who or what is conscious of this right now? Who is listening to these words? Who is having the experience of questioning their own existence? This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Not how consciousness works mechanically, but why on earth there is something that it is like to have experiences in the first place. Why aren't we just philosophical zombies, processing information and responding to stimuli without any inner light of subjective experience turned on? Neuroscientist Christoph Koch has spent decades looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific patterns of brain activity that correspond to conscious experiences, and he found many fascinating things. There are certain brain regions, parts of the cortex, the thalamus, specific structures that seem necessary for consciousness. Damage those areas and you lose aspects of conscious experience. But finding neural correlates isn't the same as explaining consciousness. It is like finding correlates of music on a vinyl record. You can identify the specific grooves that correspond to certain notes, but the grooves aren't the music. The music is something that emerges when those grooves are played. When vibration becomes sound, becomes auditory experience for a listener. Likewise, you can map every neuron firing, every neurotransmitter molecule crossing a synapse, every wave of electrical activity sweeping the cortex. But that still doesn't explain why all that electrochemical frenzy feels like something. Why is there subjective experience? Why isn't it all just information processing in the dark? Some philosophers, like David Chalmers, argue that consciousness might be fundamental, as basic as mass or electrical charge, an irreducible property of the universe. In that view, trying to explain consciousness in purely physical terms is like trying to explain why electrons have the mass they have. At some point, you arrive at fundamental properties that you simply have to accept as being what they are. Others, like Daniel Dennett, argue that the hard problem is an illusion created by mistaken intuitions about consciousness. Dennett suggests that consciousness is just sophisticated information processing, and the feeling that there is something more, some ineffable quality, some inner experience, is an illusion generated by the very system that is doing the processing. But if conscious experience itself is an illusion, who is being deluded? There seems to be a paradoxical self-awareness built in there. To be deluded about consciousness, you already need to be conscious. It is hard to fool a zombie about what it is like to be conscious, because a zombie has no experience to compare with the illusion. And maybe the point is that these questions, is consciousness fundamental or emergent? Is the self real or illusory? Might not have clean and definitive answers. Maybe the very structure of the questions presupposes distinctions that don't clearly exist in reality. Consider the question, where exactly is consciousness located? It seems like a reasonable question, but when you try to answer it, you fall into problems. Is it in the whole brain? In specific parts? What about the body? Bodily sensations are part of consciousness. So does consciousness extend throughout the body? What about the external tools that extend cognition? What about the social environment that shapes thought? You might end up concluding that consciousness isn't located in any specific place, because location presupposes the kind of sharp boundaries that simply don't exist when you look closely. Consciousness might be more like a distributed process, happening across multiple scales: neural, bodily, social, environmental, without any single point you can point to and say, here, exactly here, is where consciousness happens. Philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a famous essay called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?", where he argues that there are aspects of conscious experience that are intrinsically subjective and cannot be captured by objective, third-person descriptions. You can know everything about the neurobiology of a bat, about how echolocation works, about the neural firing patterns when a bat detects a moth. But you still wouldn't know what it is like, from the bat's point of view, to experience the world through echolocation. And if this is true for bats, it is true for other humans too. You can never know exactly what it is like to be someone else. You can have empathy, you can imagine, you can observe behavior and make inferences. But the precise phenomenological quality of another person's experience, the specific texture of how things feel to them, remains fundamentally private, inaccessible. This creates an interesting paradox for the very idea of a science of consciousness. Science depends on third-person observations, on objective measurements that can be repeated and verified by any observer. But consciousness, by its very nature, is first-person experience, subjective, accessible only to the one having it. How do you do objective science on something intrinsically subjective? The answer is, you make correlations. You ask people to report their subjective experiences, while you measure what is happening in their brains, and you look for patterns. When someone says, "I am seeing red," what neural patterns are present? When someone says, "I am feeling pain," what changes in brain activity? And this works reasonably well for experiences you share. If someone says, "I am seeing red," and you can also see the same red surface, you have reason to think your experiences are similar. But what if the experiences aren't similar? What if what I experience when I see red is more like what you experience when you see blue? But we both learn to call that experience by the same name. This is what philosophers call the problem of inverted qualia. The possibility that the subjective qualities of experience could be systematically different between people without there being a way to detect it from the outside. You and I could have completely inverted color spectra, but if our inversion is consistent, if we both call the same wavelength red, even if our internal experiences are opposites, we would never know. This probably isn't true for colors. There are neuroscientific reasons to think color experiences are relatively consistent among people with typical color vision. But the philosophical point remains. There is an aspect of conscious experience that is private, subjective, potentially incommunicable. And this brings us back to the central question of this video, but from a slightly different angle. If even your most intimate conscious experiences, the redness of red, the pain of a headache, the specific quality of a flavor, are inaccessible to anyone else, in what sense are they yours? What makes them your experiences rather than just experiences happening? The obvious answer seems to be, they are mine because I am having them. There is an I here, and that I has experiences. But we have already deconstructed this I quite thoroughly. We showed that there is no central homunculus, no unified commander. There are just processes, and the sensation of an I is one of the products of these processes. So maybe the causal direction is the reverse of what it seems. There isn't an I that has experiences. Instead, there are experiences happening, and the sense of an I emerges from these experiences as an organizational feature, a way the system represents to itself the continuity and coherence of its operations. Philosopher Galen Strawson proposed something interesting along these lines. He argues that the self isn't permanent, but also isn't entirely illusory. Instead, there are selves, momentary experiences of being a self that last maybe a few seconds and then disappear, replaced by new momentary selves. And the sensation of continuity through time is retrospective, a narrative that connects these momentary selves into a seemingly coherent story. It is like watching a movie. The movie consists of individual, static frames projected quickly, one after another. There is no real movement happening on the screen, just static frames replacing each other. But your perception integrates these frames into continuous motion. Likewise, there might be only discrete moments of experience, each with its own momentary self, but your memory and narrative integrate them into a sense of continuity. If this is starting to sound like a bunch of philosophical speculation without a definitive answer, well, you are right. Because the fact is, despite all the progress in neuroscience, psychology, philosophy of mind, we still don't have a complete and satisfying explanation of consciousness. We don't know how or why matter organized in certain ways generates subjective experience. Some people find this gap exciting, a genuine mystery yet to be solved. Others find it unsettling, even disturbing. How can we not know something so fundamental about our own nature? How can the most intimate and undeniable thing about our existence, that we are conscious, also be the most scientifically mysterious? But maybe there is something appropriate about this final ignorance. Because if consciousness is truly the context within which all knowledge arises, then trying to know consciousness objectively is like trying to see with your eyes the eyes themselves. There is a structural limit to how much a system can objectify itself. You can observe thoughts, but the observer of the thoughts is itself part of the system trying to understand. It is total self-reference, and self-referential systems have inherent logical limits. Mathematician Kurt Gödel demonstrated this formally for logical systems, that any sufficiently complex system contains truths that cannot be proved within that system. Maybe something similar holds for consciousness trying to understand consciousness. But not being completely solved doesn't mean we haven't made progress. And the progress we have made consistently points in one direction: the dissolution of boundaries that seemed obvious. Between you and your brain. Between conscious decision and unconscious neural process. Between self and non-self. Between internal and external. Between observer and observed. All these distinctions, which so deeply structure how we think about ourselves, reveal themselves to be more fluid, more negotiable, more context-dependent than our intuition suggests. And this has not just philosophical, but practical implications. Consider how this changes your relationship with suffering. If you identify totally with your thoughts and emotions, if you believe, "I am anxious, I am depressed, I am a failure," then the suffering is totalized. It defines you completely. But if you recognize that thoughts are just temporary events arising in consciousness, not fundamental truths about who you are, then there is space, there is possibility for change. Therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy incorporate exactly this insight. They don't try to change the content of thoughts directly. Instead, they try to change your relationship with thoughts, helping you see thoughts as temporary mental events rather than fixed truths about your identity. And studies show this works. People who develop this capacity for cognitive diffusion, observing thoughts without totally identifying with them, experience less suffering even when negative thoughts still arise. The content doesn't necessarily change, but the relationship with the content changes, and that shift in relationship is therapeutic. Or consider how this affects moral responsibility and ethics. If free will is an illusion, if our choices are determined by factors beyond our control, then does it make sense to blame or punish people for bad actions? If no one is ultimately the author of their own choices, the entire criminal justice system, based on individual culpability, seems to be on shaky foundations. Some philosophers, like Greg Caruso and Dirk Pereboom, argue precisely this. They suggest we should abandon the retributive model of justice, punishment based on moral desert, and adopt a consequentialist model, focused on public protection and rehabilitation. You can still isolate dangerous people from society, just as you would isolate someone with a dangerous contagious disease, but without the added element of moral judgment that they deserved punishment. Others argue that even without libertarian free will, the ability to have done otherwise in identical circumstances, there can still be room for moral responsibility. Philosopher Daniel Dennett defends a form of compatibilism, where freedom is defined not as absence of causation, but as the capacity to respond to reasons, to be moved by moral considerations. In this view, you are free not because your choices are uncaused, but because they are caused by your own deliberations, values, character, even if those in turn are products of genetics and environment. What matters morally isn't whether you could have done otherwise in some absolute metaphysical sense, but whether you are the kind of person who responds to moral reasons, who can learn from consequences, who can modify behavior based on feedback. Honestly, it isn't clear to me which view is correct. Both have strong points. And maybe the answer isn't one or the other, but something more nuanced, recognizing that different contexts require different frameworks. For public policy purposes, maybe a more consequentialist and rehabilitation-focused model makes sense. For personal relationship purposes, maybe some form of moral responsibility is necessary for trust and cooperation. And for self-understanding purposes, maybe recognizing the absence of absolute free will is liberating, reducing self-judgment and increasing compassion for both self and others. Because here is something interesting. Studies have shown that people who are exposed to messages denying free will subsequently behave a bit more antisocially, cheat more on tests, are less helpful. But other studies show that contemplative practice exploring no self leads to more compassionate and altruistic behavior, not less. The difference might be between superficial intellectual acceptance versus deep embodied understanding. Just reading about the absence of free will might undermine a sense of responsibility without providing anything in its place. But truly understanding, through sustained contemplative inquiry, the constructed nature of the self can lead to less egocentrism, less need to defend a self you recognize to be illusory anyway. So the path matters. How you arrive at these understandings, whether you arrive through abstract arguments or direct experience, whether you have contemplative support or just confront destabilizing concepts without context, all of this can affect how these ideas impact your real life. And maybe this is where we should recognize the limits of what a video like this can do. I can present arguments, evidence, philosophical perspectives. I can point to the inconsistency of certain intuitions about self and agency. But conceptual understanding isn't the same as lived transformation. You can intellectually accept that the self is an illusion and still function exactly as before, still feel all the same anxieties about self-image, still be driven by the same desires you now recognize aren't ultimately yours. Because these patterns are deeply ingrained, operating at levels that aren't easily accessible by conceptual thought alone. This is why contemplative traditions emphasize practice, not just study. Meditation, self-inquiry investigation, cultivation of awareness. These are tools for exploring the questions we have been discussing not just conceptually, but experientially. To really see in real time how thoughts arise without you summoning them. To notice the gap between stimulus and response, where choice seems to happen but might be subtler than it looks. To find the absence where you expected to find a solid self. And if you are interested in this exploration, there are resources available. There are meditation apps, retreats, teachers, books that can guide you much deeper than this video can. I am not evangelizing for any particular tradition. There are multiple paths, and what resonates varies by person. But if the questions we explored tonight touched something in you, if there is a genuine curiosity about the nature of your own mind, then direct investigation might be more transformative than intellectual analysis. At the same time, I don't want to suggest there is some final answer waiting to be discovered, some moment of enlightenment where everything resolves. The reality might be that these questions, who you are, whether the mind is yours, what consciousness is, don't have simple answers because they are pointing at something that resists neat categorizations. Maybe you are simultaneously an illusion and the most real thing about the universe. Maybe your choices are determined and yet genuinely yours. Maybe consciousness is both a product of physical processes and something that cannot be fully reduced to them. Maybe the solution isn't to solve the paradox, but to learn to live comfortably within it. And while you are here, in this moment, listening to these words, or maybe already drifting towards sleep, the words becoming more distant, more dreamlike, maybe you can simply notice the quality of the experience without trying to solve it. There is awareness, there are sensations, there are thoughts arising and passing. And whatever it is that is conscious of all this, whatever you want to call it, you, not you, consciousness, process, it is here, undeniably here, even if we can't define exactly what here means. And this here-ness, this simple and irreducible presence, might be all we need to know. Not as a concept, not as a conclusion, but as a rest, as a place to stop looking, at least for tonight, and just be whatever being means, whatever you are, it is here now, experiencing this exact moment. And there is something deeply mysterious and deeply simple about that at the same time. We spent tonight deconstructing layers. We dismantled the intuition that you are the conscious author of your thoughts. We questioned whether your desires are really yours or products of neurobiological systems you never chose. We explored how your memories might be elaborate fictions, constantly rewritten. We saw how the boundaries between you and the external world are much more porous than they seem, with bacteria influencing mood, parasites shaping behavior, external tools extending cognition. But here is something we might have left implicit without stating directly. None of this means your experience is less real. The illusion of the self doesn't make experience illusory. Pain still hurts, even if there is no one having the pain in the sense of a permanent entity separate from the pain itself. Joy is still joyful. Love is still love. Beauty still moves something deep, even if that something isn't a fixed and independent self. In fact, some people argue that recognizing the constructed nature of the self makes experience more vivid, not less. When you let go of the need to protect and defend a self you recognize to be a temporary fabrication, when you stop filtering every experience through the lens of, what does this say about me? How does this affect me? There is an opening that arises, an availability to life as it is, rather than as you need it to be to confirm your narrative about yourself. Meditation teacher Shinzen Young describes something he calls mathematical suffering. He suggests that suffering can be understood as pain multiplied by resistance. If you have pain, physical, emotional, existential, but without resistance, without the contraction around it trying to make it go away, then the suffering is minimized. It isn't that the pain magically disappears, but the additional layer of suffering on top of the suffering. The meta-pain of fighting against what is already happening, that layer can dissolve. And much of our resistance comes from this sense of self that needs to be protected. When something threatens our self-image, when something contradicts our narrative about who we are, there is contraction, there is defense. But if you recognize that self-image is just a story, a useful one sometimes but not fundamentally true, then threats to it become less urgent. This isn't insensitivity or apathy. You still care about things, still have preferences, still act in the world. But there is less egoic investment, less need for things to be a certain way for you to be okay. Because who is this you that needs to be okay? When you look closely, you don't find anything that needs protection in that way. The Buddhist monk Ajahn Chah used to use a simple analogy. He said most people are like someone holding a glass cup, constantly worried it will break. They carry the cup carefully, get anxious when someone comes near, never completely relax because the cup needs to be protected. But Ajahn Chah said that for him, the cup was already broken, not literally, but in his understanding. He knew the cup was impermanent, that eventually it would break, and by accepting that completely, he could use the cup and enjoy it without the constant anxiety of protecting it. Likewise, when you recognize that the self is already broken, that it was never the solid and permanent thing you thought, there is a release. You still live your life, still take care of things, but without the weight of trying to keep an illusion intact. And this might sound very philosophical, very abstract, but it has concrete applications. Consider how we deal with criticism. If someone criticizes you, and you identify totally with a fixed self, the criticism is a direct attack on your essence. There is a need to defend yourself, to counterattack, to prove the criticism is wrong, because accepting it might have some truth seems to threaten who you fundamentally are. But if you recognize that you are a constantly changing process, a collection of conditioned patterns and not a fixed essence, then criticism becomes just information. Maybe it is useful information about how your behaviors affect others. Maybe it isn't. You can evaluate it without the defensive urgency, because there is no monolithic self that needs to be defended. There are just patterns that can be modified or not, depending on whether modification serves your values and intentions. Similarly with failure. If you fail at something and you identify the failure with who you are, I am a failure, that is totalizing and crushing. But if you see that you are a process, then failure is just an event. A result that didn't confirm your expectations. It doesn't define you completely, because there is no complete you to define. Just temporary patterns producing different results in different contexts. That doesn't make failure pleasant. There is still disappointment. There is still the work of learning and adjusting. But there is less existential shame, less feeling that something fundamental about your identity was invalidated. And in relationships too. How many conflicts arise from trying to protect self-images? You act a certain way because that is who you are, and when a partner suggests change, you resist because it feels like a denial of your identity. Or you demand that others behave in certain ways that confirm your narrative about yourself, that you are loved, that you are respected, that you matter. But if both people recognize that these identities are flexible, that who you are isn't fixed but co-created constantly in interaction, then there is more room for growth, for change, for adapting to each other's needs without feeling you are betraying some fundamental essence. Therapist and author Mark Epstein wrote about this in the context of Buddhist therapy. He notes that much of Western psychotherapy is based on building a healthy ego, a strong sense of self, and for people with fragmented selves or damaged by trauma, that is important preliminary work. Epstein suggests that the next stage, once a functional sense of self is established, might be starting to loosen the rigidity of that self, recognizing its constructed nature. It is like building scaffolding to erect a building. The scaffolding is necessary during construction, but once the building is standing, you can remove the scaffolding. The self might be like that, a necessary structure to navigate early development, but which eventually can be recognized as provisional, not as the permanent structure you will inhabit forever. And this progression, building, then letting go, might seem contradictory, but maybe it is more like a spiral. You develop the capacity to maintain some coherence as a person, and then you relax your identification with that coherence, and then maybe you rebuild at a higher level of integration, and then let go again. It isn't linear. It isn't a simple trajectory of progress, but a continuous dance between form and dissolution. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a real danger in romanticizing ego dissolution. Some people use spiritual language about no self as an excuse to avoid responsibility. It wasn't me who did that, it was just conditioning happening. Or use it as justification to neglect basic needs. There is no self, so why take care of this body-mind? These are distortions. Recognizing the constructed nature of the self doesn't eliminate the need for care, for responsibility, for ethical consideration. If anything, it should increase compassion. If everyone is operating through conditionings they didn't choose, if no one is ultimately the author of their own neuroses and difficulties, then there is less basis for harsh judgment, more room for understanding. And you still have to live in the world, navigate society, maintain relationships, take care of responsibilities. All these things require some functional sense of identity, of continuity through time. The difference is just that you hold that sense lightly, recognizing it is a useful tool and not a metaphysical truth. It is like using money. You recognize that money is an abstraction, a collective fiction, just paper or digits on a screen that only have value because we all agreed they do. But you still use money, still participate in the system, because it facilitates exchanges that would be much harder through direct barter. You aren't under the illusion that money is real in some absolute sense, but you recognize its functional utility. The self might be similar, a useful abstraction, a fiction that allows social coordination, planning through time, learning from past experiences, but not a real entity in a metaphysical sense. And recognizing this might allow you to use the self more skillfully, assume different selves in different contexts, experiment with identity, not get stuck in a rigid narrative about who you have to be. There is a concept in psychology called self-complexity or flexibility that captures something of this. People with high self-flexibility can adapt how they present and behave depending on the context without feeling they are being inauthentic. They recognize that different aspects of themselves are appropriate in different situations. You are a different person at work versus with close friends versus with parents, and that is okay. It isn't hypocrisy. People with low self-flexibility insist on being exactly who they are in all contexts, which frequently creates unnecessary conflicts and limits adaptability. They confuse rigid consistency with integrity, when in fact integrity might be more about responding appropriately to each situation while maintaining core values, not about maintaining identical behavior in all contexts. And paradoxically, when you let go of the need to be consistently you, you might find yourself acting in ways more aligned with your values. Because you aren't defending a self-image anymore. You aren't performing an identity for internal or external audiences anymore. You are simply responding to what each moment asks, guided by values and intentions, rather than by a need to confirm who you think you are. This starts to sound like living in the moment, that spiritual cliché that has been so repeated it lost meaning. But maybe it is worth rescuing the concept because there is something genuine in it. When you aren't carrying heavy investment in a narrative about past and future, when you aren't constantly comparing the present moment with how it should be to confirm your story about yourself, there is an availability to direct experience that is qualitatively different. It is an absence of memory or planning. You still remember the past, still plan for the future. But there is less identification with the story, less need for the future to unfold in a certain way. You can hold intentions lightly, work toward goals without collapsing in despair if they don't materialize exactly as imagined. And there are studies showing practical benefits of this attitude. People who can maintain what researchers call low goal attachment, who work toward things they value but without rigidity about specific outcomes, report higher well-being than people with high goal attachment. They are more resilient when facing obstacles, less devastated by failures, more capable of adjusting course when necessary. This isn't apathy or lack of ambition. It is more like, imagine you are sailing a boat. You have a destination in mind. You adjust the sails to use the wind in that general direction. But you don't get obsessed with reaching an exact GPS point. You are responsive to conditions. If the wind changes, you adjust. If a storm comes up, maybe you temporarily change course for safety. You maintain the general direction, but with flexibility about details. Versus someone who locks the sails in one position and insists on going in a straight line, no matter what. When conditions change, they fight against them instead of adapting. And the whole process becomes harder, more stressful, less efficient. The difference lies in holding intention with openness versus holding with contraction. And part of what allows holding with openness is recognizing there isn't a fixed you whose value depends on achieving specific goals. There is just life unfolding, and you are participating in that unfolding with your particular capacities and particular limitations, doing the best you can with what you have. And the best you can varies moment by moment. Sometimes you are functioning at high capacity. Other times you are exhausted, confused, limited. If you identify rigidly with a self-image of being competent or productive, then moments of limitation become identity crises. But if you recognize that capacity fluctuates, that you aren't a fixed thing, but a process dependent on countless variables, then there is more compassion for your own limitations. This can be especially important in mental health contexts. People struggling with depression or anxiety frequently add a layer of suffering on top of the suffering, by believing they shouldn't be feeling this way, that something is fundamentally wrong with them. But if you see mental states as temporary patterns arising from causes and conditions, neurobiology, life events, sleep deprivation, any number of factors, then there is less identification with them, less feeling that this is me, forever. It still isn't easy. Depression is painful no matter how you frame it. But the framing can influence whether you add layers of shame and existential hopelessness on top of the base pain. And mindfulness-based treatments for depression are built precisely on this insight, teaching people to observe depressive states without identifying with them, without adding the narrative of, "I am broken, I will always be like this." And studies show this reduces relapse. People who learn this skill of non-identified observation are less likely to spiral back into full depressive episodes when symptoms arise. The symptoms still come: negative thoughts, low energy, anhedonia, but there is less amplification through rumination and catastrophizing. So these philosophical and contemplative insights about the nature of the self aren't just interesting abstractions. They have real therapeutic applications, practical implications for how we navigate ordinary human suffering. And perhaps, and I offer this as speculation, not as a definitive statement, perhaps part of the reason why rates of anxiety and depression seem to be growing in contemporary Western societies is precisely because we have built cultures that hyper-reinforce the illusion of the self. Social media, where you curate a public self-image, where every post is a performance of identity. Achievement culture, where your worth is constantly judged by external metrics. Extreme individualism, where you are supposed to be the autonomous author of your life, and any failure is personal failure. All of this intensifies the investment in a self that needs to be defended, promoted, protected. And when that self is threatened, which is inevitable, because life includes failure, rejection, loss, aging, death, suffering is intensified proportionally to the investment. Cultures that have more fluid concepts of self, more emphasis on interdependence than independence, might offer some protection against this particular type of suffering. Not that those cultures are free of problems. They have their own challenges. But there might be something in not placing so much weight on autonomous individual identity that reduces some kinds of existential anguish. This doesn't mean we should try to go back to pre-modern cultural structures. There is no way back, and it probably wouldn't be desirable if there were. But maybe we can integrate some of these insights into contemporary contexts, teaching children not just to build healthy egos, but also to hold identity lightly, creating cultural spaces where not knowing, not having everything solved, being a process rather than a product, are valued. There are movements in this direction: mindfulness-based education in schools, therapies integrating contemplative practices, even some corporations teaching meditation to employees, although the cynic in me notes this is often about increasing productivity, not about genuine liberation. But the general direction is encouraging, signs that these ancient understandings about the nature of the self are being translated into contemporary contexts in ways that can be genuinely useful. And while we are talking about utility, I want to briefly return to something we only touched on: implications for morality and ethics. Because you might be thinking, if there is no real self, if free will is illusory, then nothing really matters. Why be ethical? Why strive to be a good person if you aren't even real? But this nihilism doesn't follow logically. In fact, it might be the opposite. If there is no separate and independent self, if we are all interconnected through causes and conditions that don't recognize sharp boundaries between individuals, then harming others is, in some deep sense, harming oneself. There is no fundamental separation. Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh teaches something called interbeing, the idea that everything co-arises, that you cannot exist independently of everything else. You breathe air that plants produced. You eat food that came from the soil, rain, sun, labor of farmers. You think thoughts in language you absorbed from others, Every aspect of you is a manifestation of non-you. You are just a temporary pattern in the great interconnected fabric of reality. If you really see this, not just intellectually, but viscerally, then compassion arises naturally, not as a moral duty, not as a should, but as a natural response when you realize there is no fundamental separation. Harming others would be like your right hand attacking your left hand. Self-destructive, senseless. Of course, that level of visceral realization is rare. Most of us still operate primarily from the sense of separation, even if we intellectually understand interconnection. But even partial understanding can change things. If you recognize that the person annoying you is operating through conditionings they didn't choose, just like you, there is more room for patience. If you recognize that your success depends on countless external factors, there is more humility and gratitude, less arrogance. And this doesn't mean denying differences in effort or ability. Clearly, some people work harder than others, develop more skills, but even the capacity to work hard is a product of factors: dopaminergic reward circuitry, executive function of the prefrontal cortex, internalized values from caregivers, privilege of circumstances that allow focused work. You didn't choose the fundamentals that make your effort possible. So there can be appreciation for results without turning that into moral superiority. And there can be compassion for those struggling without turning that into condescension. There is just recognition of differences in circumstances, genetic endowment, life history, none of which were chosen by the people living through them. And paradoxically, this recognition of not having chosen your circumstances can coexist with active responsibility for your actions. You didn't choose your impulses, your conditionings, your neurobiology, but you can, to a certain degree, choose how you respond to them. Not free choice in the sense of uncaused choice, but choice in the sense of deliberation, of being responsive to reasons, of being able to modify behavior through learning and practice. So you are simultaneously not responsible for the initial conditions and responsible for how you work with those conditions. It is paradoxical, but manageable in practice. You develop compassion for the difficulty of the circumstances while maintaining commitment to growth and change within those circumstances. And maybe the most honest formulation is, you don't know to what extent you are in control. You don't know how many of your decisions are yours versus products of unconscious processes. Given that uncertainty, what stance makes sense? It seems a mix of humility and agency is sensible. Humility about how much you really understand or control your own processes, but agency in the sense of acting as if your choices matter, of trying to align behavior with values, of not using uncertainty about free will as an excuse for passivity. It is like Pascal's wager, but for agency instead of God. Even if you aren't sure you have free will, it might make more sense to act as if you have some degree of choice, because the alternative, total fatalism, isn't livable, and probably isn't accurate anyway. Even determinists admit that deliberation and choice are real processes, even if determined. So you act, you choose, you live. But with lightness, with recognition that you are operating with incomplete information about your own processes, with compassion for your own limitations and the limitations of others. And when you mess up, which you will because everyone messes up, there can be less self-flagellation. Not because mistakes don't matter, but because you recognize that the mistake arose from causes and conditions, some visible and some not. You learn what you can, adjust what you can, and move on without adding layers of shame over what has already happened and cannot be changed. There is a phrase I heard from Buddhist teachers: no blame, no shame, no excuses. No blame and shame because those are often about protecting a self-image rather than genuine moral evaluation. But no excuses because you still assume responsibility, still work to do better, still recognize the impact of your actions on others. It is a delicate balance. And honestly, no one does it perfectly. We oscillate between extremes, sometimes too stuck in guilt and shame, sometimes too quick to absolve responsibility. The work is to keep recalibrating, continuously finding that middle ground between compassion and responsibility. And maybe the most important point is, these aren't questions to solve once and then you are done. They are questions to live, to explore continuously, to revisit in different phases of life with different levels of understanding. Who you are, whether your mind is yours, the nature of consciousness, these questions will keep unfolding as you live. Every experience offers a new perspective. Every relationship reveals new aspects of the self or non-self. Every challenge tests your understandings, shows where you really embodied insights and where you are still operating from old patterns. And that is okay. Actually, it is perfect. Because if you really are a process rather than a fixed thing, then of course your understanding of yourself would also be a process, always unfolding, always revealing itself, never completely finished. So where does that leave us after this long night journey through neuroscience, philosophy, contemplation? Maybe back where we started, but with a slightly different perspective. You are still here, listening to these words, or maybe floating somewhere between waking and sleeping. There is still experience happening, thoughts, sensations, maybe doubts about everything said, maybe just peaceful stillness. And whatever is conscious of all this, we explored all the reasons to question whether it is what you think it is. But we didn't deny that something is here, conscious, experiencing. Maybe the best way to hold all these complexities is with curiosity instead of certainty. Instead of deciding the self is an illusion or the self is real, both might be gross simplifications of something subtler. You can simply keep looking, keep exploring, keep noticing what experience is actually like, without rushing to definitive conclusions. And in daily life, this might translate into just a little more lightness, a little less identification with every passing thought, a little more compassion when you or others act in imperfect ways, a little more gratitude for the strange miracle of being conscious in the first place, of experience happening, no matter how we understand its origin or nature. Because in the end, and maybe this is the simplest and deepest insight, no matter how deep you dig, you always find mystery. Mystery in the origin of thoughts, mystery in the nature of consciousness, mystery in why there is something rather than nothing. And maybe the invitation isn't to solve these mysteries, but to learn to rest in them, to make a home in not knowing. Small children are naturally comfortable with not knowing. They ask endless questions. Why? 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 Not necessarily looking for final answers, but simply exploring, full of wonder. And then at some point, many of us learn that not knowing is a weakness, that we should have answers, that uncertainty is something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. But maybe there is wisdom in recovering something of that childlike curiosity, in being okay with "I don't know" as a final answer to the biggest questions, in keeping openness to mystery rather than rushing for closure. And if your mind isn't exactly yours in the way you thought, if the you is more fluid and more interconnected than it seemed, well, there. That is just more mystery to sit with, more wonder about the strangeness of being alive, conscious, experiencing this impossible, inexplicable gift of existence. As you listen to this now, or as you drift into sleep, or even if you are already asleep, these words, just waves of sound, becoming thoughts without you knowing exactly how. Wherever you are on that spectrum of consciousness, there is something perfectly okay about just being that, without needing to fully understand, without needing to solve everything, just being whatever is happening now, in this moment, with as much kindness and curiosity as you can muster. And if you wake up tomorrow and all this exploration seems distant, abstract, irrelevant to the concrete challenges of living, that is also okay. You can carry what is useful and let go of the rest, because these ideas aren't meant to be held rigidly, aren't another doctrine to defend. They are just perspectives, potential tools, invitations to look from different angles, use what serves, let go of what doesn't, and keep living, exploring, growing, or changing if growing implies a direction that might not be appropriate. Keep being whatever you are, which is always more than any concept can capture anyway. So thank you for being here tonight, for lending your attention to these strange and definitively unanswered questions. Thank you for your curiosity, for your willingness to consider uncomfortable possibilities, for not tuning out when things got abstract or disturbing. And if you are awake, I hope you find your way to peaceful sleep soon, carrying perhaps a little less weight about who you have to be, a little more permission to just be what you are. And if you are already asleep, then maybe these thoughts weave into your dreams, or maybe not. It doesn't matter. The important thing is rest, recovery, letting go for a few hours of the need to be anyone in particular. Good night, or good morning, depending on where and when you are. Thank you for sharing this space, this time, this exploration. Take good care of yourself, or rather, take good care of this temporary process of consciousness that is unfolding as you for now. And remember, whenever you need to, you don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to know who you are with definitive certainty. You can simply live, moment by moment, with as much presence and compassion as possible, and let the mystery be mystery. Rest well, and maybe, on the edges of sleep, you will find that stillness where questions about self and non-self dissolve into something simpler, just presence, just awareness, just this, whatever this is. Good night.